Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Greetings of peace, love, and light. Friends and family around the world, I'm your host, Baraka Blue, and you are tuned in to Path and Present podcast. This conversation is with the multi-talented writer, poet, translator, and musician, Medina Tenour Whiteman, who is the author of a collection of poetry entitled Love is a Traveler and We Are Its Path, as well as Huma's Travel Guide to Islamic Spain. She's someone who lives near Granada, Spain, and is a friend and very talented individual. And we have a wonderful conversation about spirituality and the arts and writing and poetry and many other things. This is the last episode in this season of Path and Present. I want to thank you all for listening and for supporting. We will take a month-long hiatus after this in order to record the next season, and we'll be back in January. I want to say thank you for everyone who is supporting on Patreon and encourage you, if you want to see this podcast continue, if you value these conversations, the best way that you can do it is to become a patron on patreon.com/pathandpresent. And there are various tiers, and there are a lot of perks and access to things that only the people on the Patreon get. For instance, we have some conversations that are just for the patrons, including amazing conversations with people like Professor William Chittick, as well as A. Helwa, Michael Sugich, and Abdullah Rothman, and many, many more opportunities. So please visit patreon.com/pathandpresent. It is really only through the community support that we're able to continue these conversations. And again, I want to give a special shout out and thank you for our sponsor for this season, Sufi Corner, which is a wonderful organization in New York, New Jersey, spreading the light and the beauty of Sufism, Islamic arts, and Islamic intellectual history. And I encourage everyone to follow them on Instagram, as well as their website and other social media at Sufi Corner. And with that, I want to again just extend my deep gratitude for all of you and welcome you if anyone wants to join us for our upcoming course on the 99 names, starting January 1st, first 99 days of the year, blessed way to ring in the new year. And you can learn more about that at rumicenter.love. All right, y'all. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. First and foremost, alhamdulillah, we ask Allah that He uses us as instruments of His light to convey whatever goodness and whatever beauty and whatever truth that He wills to be conveyed to any being who may hear this, and may it reach our hearts first, and may we be those that benefit, and may we be those that learn, and may we be those that grow, and may we be those that are His vessels of light through which it passes, inshallah.
Ameen.
And may Allah guide our tongues and our hearts to whatever it is that He loves, and facilitate every good for us and for every being that He loves, inshallah. Ameen. Alhamdulillah. Well, my sister Medina, I'm very happy to have you and to have you on the podcast. And there's so many places that we could explore because, like this podcast, tends to be multidisciplinary and multi-topical. And I know you're someone who's very multidisciplinary and multi-topical yourself. But I thought a beautiful entry point for us would be to speak about our one of the things that binds us, which is that we have a shared teacher, shared mentor in the art of poetry. And that's, of course, Daniel Abdul Moore. And you are the one behind, I don't know if I'm revealing a secret, but I know you've been behind the Ecstatic Exchange and the Instagram and kind of keeping the legacy alive. Um, so I wonder if, of course, his uh, his tagline and his website is ecstatic exchange. But I think a lot of people still don't really understand the significance of him, especially for Muslims in the English speaking world. So I don't know if maybe you might say a few words about him, and then also like your relationship with him and his family, and um, whatever else you're up to in sharing his light.
Mm. Thanks so much for inviting me on this podcast. Mashallah, I think it's an incredible endeavor and a beautiful intention to bring the arts of the Muslim world to as big an audience as possible. And speaking of which, yeah, my poetry mentor, our poetry mentor, Daniel Abdahimo, Allah yarhamu, he continues to be a very important influence in my life in that sense, and particularly my work. Not just because of the work that I've been doing in publicizing his poetry and trying to share his legacy as much as possible and show its relevance. So a little bit about Abdullahi. Well, he was born in 1940 in Oakland, California, and he actually began studying at Berkeley University, but then his teacher told him he didn't need university, so he dropped out and he formed the Floating Lotus Magic Opera Company, which was in his own terms, sacred theater company. So their intention at that time, this was during the Vietnam War, they saw, and I see a lot of parallels to our times right now, they saw a huge amount of violence, a huge amount of injustice, a huge amount of um, militarism and imperialism in their time, and they were protesting about it in their own ways. And so for him, as an artist in the Bay Area in the 1960s, late 60s, um, early 70s, he was very close to, he was kind of the tail end of the beat generation, but he rubbed shoulders with a lot of beat poets. His first collection of books of poetry was Dawn Visions, and that was published by City Lights Books of San Francisco, published by Lawrence Ferlinghetti. And that was in 1964. And so he was kind of well known in that area. Obviously, I wasn't there at the time, but this is just from what I've gleaned from speaking with Malika, his wife, Allah yarhamha. And, it was wild. There was a lot of crazy things happening at the time, a lot of interest in again, quote unquote, Eastern mysticism or whatever their interpretations of that were. There was a Zen Roshi Suzuki. Oh, what was his name? Shunryu Suzuki.
Mhm.
And so he was participating in those Zazen sittings. He was, also just engaging in all the things that people were engaging with at that time, taking a lot of acid and seeking mind expansion, right? I mean, I believe his intention all along was to open his mind and to to know the truth, to know reality. And people, Allah takes people on different paths in that regard. And then he was very interested in Rumi. He found a collection by translation by Nicholson, and he would actually give readings in the hallway of his big like brownstone. It was like an artist commune. He lived in a little garret in the attic, writing his poems on a typewriter. He would give these readings of Rumi. So he was already kind of tapped in at that point to Sufism, what he knew of Sufism. And then he was actually uh, introduced to Moroccan Sufism. Um, uh, it's a very long story. You can read more about it in the selected poems. But this was in 1971, I believe. And then he made Hajj. I think it was the year after. No, he became Muslim in 1970, sorry. And he performed the Hajj in 1972.
Mhm.
And so his poetry suddenly changed. It became infused with a huge amount more. Well, his whole life changed, actually. He didn't write any poetry for 10 years. He was told not to write poems for 10 years because he was writing very abundantly. I mean, he was completely obsessed with writing poetry. And at that time, it was like, okay, now it's time to turn the tap off and just fill up what's on the inside and see that that's sound and, clear, let's say. And so he was practicing a lot of zikr, a lot of reading awrad, and obviously just praying. And his whole, the focus of his life kind of changed. And then some 10 years, also did a lot of travel in that time. He lived in Nigeria for a while. He traveled to Algeria. He was in Spain. He was in Grenada and in the UK. And then coming back to California, he kind of landed again around about 1982, Santa Barbara, and he began writing poems again. And what came out, Malika describes as like it was the floodgates opened. And this was something that was very much, it wasn't that he went from one, sorry, that's somebody at the door. It wasn't that he went from one style of writing to another. He had all these influences, the surrealists, Andre Breton, the romantics. He was very influenced by William Blake, Rimbaud. He was influenced by Mexican surrealists. He was, kind of an encyclopedia of poetry. He knew an awful lot about poetry and a lot about poetic form. But then adding into that, not only like a worldview, like a Sufi worldview, Islamic worldview, but also like the whole body of Sufi literature that suddenly opened up to him. His poetry became a synthesis of these different things. But because he was so good at just putting the pen to the paper, and what came out came out. And in whatever extraordinary and everyday ways, he made those at times, potentially very abstruse concepts very relevant and very relatable. And because he put them into a context of who he was in his time as an American man, living a average kind of American existence at the same time, so in that sense, I think he's an incredible bridge for those of us who are trying to reconcile these different ways. For me, like reading Sufi texts written 1,000 years ago or 800 years ago or something, you can see the application of it in your life, but you also have to do a little bit of work to make that bridge and to see how it's going to be integrated. Because it also needs to be real, right? It needs to be something that is practicable. So yeah, his poetry is quite it's really unique. You won't find poems like it anywhere else, I think.
Yeah. No, and I think because of that, that almost it actually takes a certain straddling of worlds to be able to appreciate him and what he's done. And that's why I feel like almost like even though the beats kind of like, saw him as one of these bright, shining young lights, and he was really influential in that scene at a young age. When he took the path and became Muslim, it was like his poetry after was like two beat poet for the Muslims and
Yeah.
two Muslim for the beat poet. So it was kind of like lost in translation. But I think for a generation coming after him, like yourself and myself, there's actually a generation that grew up in both worlds, not just people that are children of converts who embraced Islam like us, but actually people that are growing up in multiple contexts, the children of immigrants who grew up in the English speaking world and are navigating all these things. And so I feel like, interestingly enough, he may speak more to our generation than his generation,
Yeah.
in a really interesting way. And I wanted to add um, a story that he told me, and I remember very fondly in the Bay Area. We had this RV called the Dicker Wagon, and so he came, and Abdul Haymor and Abdul Bari McCabe and that generation that were all together, and they're telling us that, of course, Abdul Hayy and Hakim Archuleta, the well-known, I don't even know, Hakim, specialist in
Yeah.
traditional Islamic medicine and wellness and all around brilliant soul. That they were living together, they were friends, and they were in this commune, and they were putting on all these like plays, and they were like burning effigies of like men made out of bread, and they're really like almost like the cutting edge, where like the hippies were like not avant-garde enough, right? The hippies kind of like took nods from them, what they were doing. But anyway, they said that essentially, and there's an earlier episode with Hakim Archuleta for anyone interested where he tells the whole story. But basically, what I recall of that their entry into Sufism and Islam is, like you said, they were reading all this mystical poetry from around the world, and um, someone by the name of Abdul Qadir Sufi, who you're well acquainted with, who was a muqaddam of one of the great Sufis, or representative of one of the great Sufis, Sheikh Mohammed ibn al-Habib in Morocco, basically heard about them and sought them out. Like, he
Mm,
basically showed up in the Bay Area, even though he was from was Scotland or the United Kingdom. And basically, they mentioned that they picked him up and they had this day or two with him, and he came and he said, essentially, I come as a representative of this unbroken chain of saints and enlightened masters back to the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. And he comes in a successive, line of prophets all the way through Jesus and Moses and Abraham, all the way back to Adam. Like this real, like, epic kind of presentation. And he's like, and I come to basically give you the path. And they were like, right on. They were like, this is, and apparently they mentioned that after like a day or two with him, he essentially said to them, he said, now I've delivered this this message, and either you're going to accept this and take the path and we'll journey together, or I'm going to disappear and you'll never see me again, right? So basically very theatrical
no, he actually
presentation.
walked downstairs and left him to like make the decision on the spot,
Right?
like read a newspaper or something. Like, I'll wait. I'll just go down here and wait, and you can go and think about it, and then come to me. And of course, who wouldn't in that situation be like, okay, come on, this is something's been brought to me. It's totally not something that I've gone and sought specifically, but I'm just been open to. It's come to me and
Mm.
handed it on a plate. I would be crazy to like walk away from this.
But one of the details that Abdul Hai mentioned is that, after he said, okay, I'm in, then Abdul Qadir said, okay, now go basically take a bath, right, to initiate the purification of entering into this path. And so he went into the bath, and there was already three people in the bathtub, and he said, like, hey, can I get in the bath? And they're like, sure, come on in. And he said, no, no, like, can you get out so I can get in? So this was the kind of environment
Yeah.
that
Oh,
they
there's
were
some
in.
stories. There's some
Yeah.
stories that couldn't make it into print, let's say.
Yes. Yeah. No, and that was in a different time. And I think one of the things that people don't or is underappreciated, shall we say, um, is that in that time of turning east for spirituality and the deep openness of Western youth, let's say, definitely aided by, as you mentioned, LSD and other mind expanding substances, where there was this deep interest in the East. And so many people, went to India to find a guru. And of course, it wasn't marginal. It was the number one pop
Mm,
band was on the cover of Time, going to India with their guru, of course, the Beatles. So it was mainstream at that
mm,
point. But what people don't realize is that there was this whole stream of people that either went to North Africa, went to Morocco and found Sufi sheikhs, or were going to India, but it was like the hippie trail where you pass through Turkey and you pass through Afghanistan and you pass through Iran and you pass through Pakistan, all to get to India. And these were very they were very much like pre-modern at that time. And so a lot of the elders in our community were on their way to find a guru in India and found a Sufi sheikh in one of these countries. And that's like a really undertold story, underrepresented um, story. And I don't know if that is a good place to tie in, because, of course, Abdul Hai isn't just someone who you appreciated his poetry, but you, through your family, through your parents, had a particular connection to this experience. I wonder if you might just say a few words about that.
yeah, so just briefly, my parents both came into Islam independently of each other. My mother's from the States, and she was very much seeking some kind of, I guess, a vision of hope, because she was living in a time of it seemed very, uh, very hopeless. Um, again, as I mentioned, a lot of violence. She went to a civil rights march and saw the National Guard being deployed. I mean, it was frightening. She describes it as being a very frightening time. And just coming from her own like small town kind of dysfunctional scenario, she wanted, she wanted to find something that would offer her some, not just like a sense of personal peace, but like some kind of sense, like make sense of it all. And initially she was interested in Buddhism again, like Abdul Hayy, although they didn't know each other at the time, and she did a Vipassana. She couldn't get on board with the idea of karma, like somebody being born into a certain situation because of the sins of their past life. She couldn't get on board with that. And then someone introduced her to Sufism, but initially it was just, she read in a book, try saying over and over, La ilaha illallah. And she did it. She said she felt something. There was some kind of shift inside herself. So she said, okay, this is for real. I'm going to explore this. Again, it was also frightening for her because it was very different. It was all new. And initially, I think it was through the Chishtis and then through various different Sufi communities in the US, which were really nascent at that time. Then ended up with, well, I'm telling her whole life story here. I need to interview her, but she ended up with the community around Sheikh al-Hairi in Texas, at the time they were in Texas. And that's where she met my dad. And my dad had, a few years before that, around about the same time, but, separate. He had been a professional musician in London in the 60s. And again, had sort of rubbed shoulders with all the big names that his band had supported, the Rolling Stones on tour. And, watching them like drawing a pentacle on the ground and like writhing around, worshipping Satan, it was like, okay, it was probably just theatrics, but they found that very distasteful. And they were into like Gurdjieff and just like, again, Eastern mysticism in this very kind of broad, vague way. But open, they were just open to something. They were open to learning and discovering. And then the same thing happened. The same teacher came and found, well, he was based in London at that time, Sheikh Abdul Qadir Sufi, and some members of my dad's band had connected with him. And so then he went to a gathering and heard the singing. And him as a musician, as a singer, something switched on for him. That was his kind of light. Like everybody has their little light that switches on somehow. It might be through art, it might be through music, it might be through poetry, it might be through community service, it could be all kinds of things, right? Or philosophy. There's something that is already ready in you that's latent, you have this kind of latency, and then it just has a ground to land on. And what he found also, he talks about this, he has written a book as well called Average White Man. You can read the whole story there. But just from what he's told me all through my life is, they looked around them and they saw a lot of pain and emptiness, and they saw how the lifestyle of sort of rock and roll lifestyle or progressive rock, even the mods, he was in a mod band very early on, which then evolved into the sort of prog rock that he was doing. There was obviously a lot of alcohol, a lot of drugs. The folk scene was also had a lot of alcohol. One of the women that he performed alongside or did session work with was Sandy Denny, one of the most brilliant songwriters, incredible folk songwriter. And she, fell down the stairs drunk, pregnant, died at like 27. Really tragic stories that were happening all around them. And they were like, well, how do we escape this? Like we've come into this for the love, for the joy, for the beauty, for the sort of expansion. They were seeking that kind of expansiveness, like a spiritual expansion and a consciousness expansion. And yet it was attracting or bringing into it a lot of, you could say, demons, really. Like it was very, very ugly and frightening for them as well. And on top of that, the music itself was not even that amazing. I mean, now we look back and it's like, wow, it was the most incredible period. Yeah, I guess for like pop music, yeah, it was a really incredible period. There was definitely some genuine musical geniuses at work there. But for them, there was also like, this is coming out of people's egos. It's not really coming from a source that is grounded in something greater, right? So like, and this is what you can say, there's about all kinds of music, like particularly music from the music industry, right? So I think we can make a distinction between music as people humming as they work or as they're just going about their day. Animals are singing, there's folk music, folk traditions, which are not bound to a particular performer, an artist with an aura around them of this or that, and, with a whole image. And so when my dad came in touch with, or first heard Andalusi Sufi music from Morocco, this is from the Andalusis who were exiled from Spain, but their musical traditions have been preserved in Morocco, many other parts of North Africa, but particularly Morocco. He was really blown away by it. First of all, musically, it's very complex, but very beautiful and harmonious. I mean, if you listen to Andalusi music, there's something that they do where they go in between major and minor. In a single song, they'll go between major and minor. And there is actually a maqam. I think the name of it is Rushed, but I haven't done my homework on that one. It's actually the one that's used for healing, and it has a quarter tone in the third. So it's in between major and minor. So music that has this kind of shift between major and minor actually has this healing quality to it. So even without thinking about it, without knowing why, he was sensing that there was something about it that was very beautiful in a transcendent way, not just in a specific kind of, this person is very aesthetically capable or something like that. And then on top of that, you have the words. So the Diwan of Sheikh Muhammad ibn al-Habib, which has also been a huge influence in my own life, musically and poetically. The words of it, I can remember my reading, sitting in a dhikr and reading off of my mum's really old handwritten book that she'd written out the diwan in her own hand. This is in the 1970s, a leather-bound book, transliteration, and then the translation underneath. Of course, these people were coming into Islam without any knowledge of Arabic at all. So just painstakingly writing out the transliterations and then the translations. And so you learn the words, but you also learn it with the translation, because that's, you kind of can't get away from that in a way. The translation is so important because they're really poems that are sung. And so you have lines like, إِنَّمَا كَوْنٌ مَعَانٍ قَائِمَةٌ بِالصُّوَرِ, truly the world, the cosmos, existence is meaning set up in images. And you come across a line like that, you can spend a lifetime unpacking that. You can spend a lifetime being guided by that and thinking about it and applying it in your context, in your time, in your life, in your family, in your own personal way. And it's still universal. It transcends all of these axes of time and space. So I think this was, for him, it was music, definitely. Now, I think both of them had, I think it's fair to say, some kind of experience, like an experiential transition, because of connecting with this and because of being exposed to it. And of course, you have the book learning, and it's phenomenal what you can study. Islam is an ocean of ilm, of science, and there's so many things to study. But the Sufis were, and not just Sufis, but many mystics, poets, philosophers will always say there's the lived experience as well, and you have to have that to be able to integrate it. Otherwise, it's abstraction, and I think, well, this is my personal view of it, is I think there's a very big danger of allowing yourself to stay just in the abstraction, just as staying exclusively in your lived experience can also be very limiting. But there's this sort of dance between the two of them, you could say. But, Ibn Arabi, for example, would say that the truth lies beyond both of those. You have your book learning, you have your knowledge of phenomena, you have your science, your quantitative knowledge, and then you have the lived experience, the ahwal, the states, you have ecstasy, you have dhawq, you have tasting. The truth is actually beyond that. Junaid also says the same thing. Many Sufis will say the same thing.
That's beautiful. And I think, the philosophers, they talk about the theoretical intellect and the practical intellect. So that, of course, we think about theoretical intellect as being able to grasp truth and grasp reality and discern between truth and falsehood. As you say, it can be somewhat abstract, but then I love this concept of the practical intellect is actually being able to then embody that in your life, and being able to apply virtue and separate virtue and vice and live with wisdom and grace, that it's actually a type of intellect, which we don't necessarily think about that. But it also is basically encapsulated in the Shahada, because it's La ilaha illallah, which is a statement about the nature of reality, which is true whether there is a world, whether there is other beings, whether there is our individual lives. It's just a state, it's about the nature of truth and reality and being no God but God, this unity. But then Muhammad and Rasulullah is the embodied human manifestation into the realm of multiplicity, and how to live with wisdom and virtue and grace and try to apply that ultimate truth in our lived realities. Um, and I'm really glad also that you mentioned like the importance of the arts and poetry, even in the the way that these Western seekers came into the Sufi tradition, this sung poetry. And I was thinking about this because actually Sidi Harun Michael Sugic mentioned this to me, and I had never thought of it in this way. But he mentioned that um, the reason that so many amazing artists and musicians and poets entered into this community, which, you know, this is another podcast to talk about that whole history. And yeah, we should interview your father, who's written a book about that. But essentially, it wasn't just, you know, there was photographers and writers and playwrights and all kind of people came into this community under Abdul Qadir Sufi. But I always like was in awe of the people that were drawn. But one thing that Sidi Harun mentioned, he said it was because Abdul Qadir was an artist that
Mm,
he drew artists. So he came out of the kind of like theater world. And then Sidi Harun mentioned, he said, when in the time of, you know, like even, you know, traditional Sufi sheikhs, they often draw people from a similar experience. So he mentioned that, I think it was when Sheikh Muhammad al-Habib, you know, he drew a lot of scholars because he was this great scholar. And then he mentioned that after him, you know, if you had a sheikh that was a, you know, a carpenter or worked with his hands, he would draw people from that domain of society. He would draw people that were workers often. And then if you had a sheikh that was, you know, from an upper class, he would often draw people from the upper class. If you had someone who was maybe unlettered and wasn't trained in a traditional study, but had these spiritual openings, they would often draw people from that segment of society. And while there is an absolute universality in the great realized ones, there also is that their lived reality or their embodied experience is going to draw people from a similar shared experience that are, you know, because you're going to speak, even if the light that is pure passes through the vessel of a being, it takes on the color of that vessel, as it were. um so I just think that's really important, actually, is that the arts were this primary means for people to come in contact with the beauty of this tradition, the diwan, the sung poems of the great master, you know. And I think this also has a precedent in just Islamic history. You know, art is the means by which the deepest truths of a religion are articulated to the masses, because what you just mentioned about that line about, you know, meaning set up in forms, the whole cosmos is meaning, you know, set up in forms, is basically a very deep philosophical, metaphysical. There's all these like books in Ibn Arabi school about these realities, but you can yet put them in a line of poetry, and it can speak to the shopkeeper or the one who works the fields or whatever, without being able to necessarily read all these high level metaphysical treaties. um so yeah, and I also like there's something about the art that bypasses, right? This Abdul Hai called it, his phrase, the ecstatic exchange. There's something ecstatic that almost bypasses the rational faculty and enters into like the imaginal faculty and allows us to experience things, like bypasses something that I think especially modern Western people need. So I
mm.
don't know if that brings something
Yeah,
up for you.
I agree. I think it's interesting that he chose that expression particularly, and he was very much of the type of writer that would wake up in the night having had a strange dream, put his pen to paper, and just let whatever come out, come out. He was very, very, very connected. His pen was very connected to his subconscious, or you could say soul, however you want to look at it, in the sense that it was like unfiltered. It was very unfiltered to the point where it was so overabundant that like trying to edit down a selection of poems was really hard, because like on many of his poems were, very long or kind of breathless. There's no punctuation. It's like it's just pouring out of him. So mashallah, I mean, he really had a gift in that regard, and that's something that we can also learn from. I find free writing is a great antidote to that kind of stilted um, way of being that we've become very accustomed to because of external judgments, because of external values, extrinsic values. We think about what other people are going to say. We think about how other people are going to view us, and up to a point, there's some sense in that. You can tell, obviously, like you don't want to go around just hurting people or offending everybody. But at the same time, to be so restricted inwardly that you can't allow that, uh, that deep voice that wells up. It needs to be articulated. It needs to be done in some way, passed into some kind of medium, whether it's a word or it's visual arts or it's movement or it's sound, it's song. It needs to be expressed in some way. And then you have that feeling of, oh, I'm not just a brain in a jar, I'm not just a bunch of thoughts and data that has been absorbed from somewhere else. It's coming in and it's coming out. That's the exchange. There's something that I'm receiving and I'm able to also give. And the ecstatic side of that is the ecstasy is a state. It's in that realm of the states, and that kind of, you could call it emotional intelligence, or maybe it's psychological. It's kind of a combination of those different things. I don't think we necessarily have a word in our contemporary kind of language to sort of encapsulate that. You could also talk about somatics. You could say it's a part of somatics because it's an experience. um, when people talk about somatics, and particularly in the sense of healing, you come to understand that actually, that flight into the intellect in a very exclusive way, that kind of rationalism, is actually a trauma response. It's a
Mm-hmm.
way of shutting down feeling, because feeling can be painful, but feeling can also be ecstatic. There's a whole realm of feeling which, again, we don't want to get bogged down in it either. But to shut it down entirely, it means that you miss out on all of these, the full range of human experience, which I think is a huge shame. And again, it's like the truth lies beyond both of those. So if you're looking for the truth, you can't get stuck in either one. Like, you can't hide in the intellectual. You can't hide in that, university ivory tower and think that academia is going to solve all your problems and answer everything. Because we've all met people with PhDs who are a complete mess. They don't necessarily, solve problems in the real world. Um, and likewise, we have to have that kind of balance, but recognizing that ultimately the truth is beyond either of those things, because the truth is constant. And these things are conditional, right? They're contingent. Knowledge, like book learning, data, it might be cumulative. You might continue learning. You might forget things, to get a different interest, and suddenly your books lie half finished, like most of mine are. Um, and states are also passing, and they're transient. And as important as they are for helping us to understand that we are human beings, we're not made of metal or glass. We're not buildings, we're not computers. And within that range of human experiences, you have relationships, you have community, you have grief, you have joy, you have all of these different things which we shouldn't shut down either. um, and yet still the truth is beyond those things, because it's not contingent. We're contingent on it.
Mm. Yeah, no, I think it's very interesting that he called it ecstatic exchange as well. And um, we were talking previously about the word in Arabic, wajd, which is ecstasy, and the root, trilateral root in Arabic, also making the word wujud, which is being. Um, and, you know, wajid or wajid, you could say, is consciousness or finding. So it's actually that there's this like resonant field in Arabic, as you know, of meanings in all of these words. So the sense that actually we talk about being or existence in English, but it doesn't have the same concepts. This field of the idea that existence itself is about finding, about consciousness, about being able to experience, being able to witness, and that this itself is a type of ecstatic. It's and that's why the for the Sufis, especially Sufi poets, there's so many um, images around madness and drunkenness, because there's this sense that the true existence or true consciousness is actually somewhere beyond our everyday consciousness. And so just like madness or drunkenness, in a certain sense, you transcend your normal consciousness, but there's a super rational, so that if we could actually experience this, we would all be in ecstasy if we could experience this. And um you know the in the Hindu tradition, they say Sat Chit Ananda, being consciousness bliss or ecstasy, the being like the nature of the divine reality, being consciousness bliss. Um, and basically all of those are in that root, right? Being, wujud, consciousness, wajada, and then bliss, wajd. So I think just that the fact that that's embedded in the Arabic language
Mm.
is really fascinating. And David Bentley Hart, who's a Christian philosopher, he wrote this book called The Experience of God, Being Consciousness Bliss. And it was basically responding to the new atheist, saying like, what you're critiquing about what God is not what the great mystics, philosophers have ever said that God is. It's so much, it's not a being, it's being, right?
Mm.
um so I think that that's really interesting that Abdul Hai, and Abdul Hai, as you know, like I always say, he was one of the most truly inspired people. That he was, like you say, he was just kind of in this awe,
Mm.
actually, of
Yeah,
everything.
he was in
And what's that?
I think he lived in a kind of state of wonderment,
Yes.
people talk now also of like the re-enchantment of the world and
Yes.
the moving away from this sort of modern in its like historical sense uh mentality of that the earth is this inert um separate being. We need to be separate from it. Sort of, Western Christianity, which I don't think is necessarily true to what Jesus' teachings were, alayhi salam, but very much about the earth being a place of darkness, a place of contamination, pollution, fear, and that man had to kind of rise above it and be separate from it and dominate over that. And actually, I think that Islam really presents a whole vision that is completely different from that. Like we're able to, first of all, like looking at the way that people are buried in Spain, in Catholic graveyards, the bodies are treated with like formaldehyde or something like this. Then they're cemented into niches, which are rented over a period of time. The families have to rent a niche in a graveyard for their loved ones who've passed away. Whereas if you go to a Muslim graveyard, you're cleansed, your bodies are cleansed, perfumed, wrapped in cloth, and put straight into the earth. There's not this sense that we have to be away from the earth. And that's something that, again, I find that Abdul Hai, and actually I'll read a poem to demonstrate, because I think he really saw that line, that the world is meaning set up in images, that the poetry of his vision was the metaphor, that it was the seeing through the material into the meaning behind it, right?
Mhm.
Which is an opening of the perception towards the divine, essentially, but to be able to see it everywhere and not just in one specific place, like a place of worship or a holy site. That a holy site could actually be practically anywhere. So I'll read a poem, since you asked me before to bring one. It's one of my favorite poems by him, I think probably of by anyone. It's called Apple Peel Epiphany. And it's a ghazal, actually. I was peeling an apple in the sink, round and round, listening to a tape repeating the name of God. when suddenly the peal went on forever, extending past time and space, as if ignited by the flame of God. Past walls and windows out in the sky, past our planetary horizon completely. The apple peel stretched way past even my own existence, it seemed, into the frame of God. It was only a moment. I don't mean to say it lasted as long as it seemed. But the peel went on spiraling under my knife as if in a whimsical game of God. Dizzy and bewildered for a second or two, holding the end of a mystical thread. The peel uncoilingly reached into a mysterious dimension to the eternal acclaim of God. Mortal body in a material world. I mean, things aren't all what they seem. Things aren't at all what they seem. Remembering God's true extra spatial dimension seems to be a delightful aim of God. So this is from a series of 99 ghazals that he wrote, beginning in Konya, actually. The collection is called The Flame of Transformation Turns to Light, and it's collected from a Shorby on Water, the selected poems.
MashaAllah. Yeah. That's beautiful. Yeah, I mean, and I think in a certain sense, I know you also teach poetry and writing, and you know, how to communicate poetry to people is not easy, and how to teach poetry, it's kind of a strange thing where like you can't really teach it, but yet you know there you have to say something like what can be said. You can point in a direction, but you know, poetry being that which is essentially metaphor, and a metaphor is seeing the connections between apparently unlike things, right? So there's two things that appear to have nothing in common, and so metaphor is seeing that actually, if you scratch beneath the surface, they do have something, they are connected. And that's interesting because in a certain sense, that's what the believers are asked to do. I mean, that's why, I mean, there's such a connection between mysticism and poetry, and like, but there's a sense of being able to see the connections in apparently unlike things. And you know, as an interesting corollary or commentary of that line that we've been going back to from Sheikh Muhammad ibn Habib about meaning set up in forms is, you know, a symbol is literally a meaning set up in a form, right? A symbol. So let's say symbolic is the ability to see that whatever you're looking at is pointing at a meaning beyond itself, which, you know, you could translate ayat, the signs or the symbols. We will show them our signs or our symbols on the horizons within themselves. It's Quranic teaching that everything around us and within us is symbolic. But interestingly enough, even in the etymology, the opposite of symbolic is diabolic. Symbolic is literally two together. So it's to connect the meaning with the form. Diabolic is to separate the meaning from the form. And it's very interesting that what was Iblis's fall from grace was literally ana khayra minhu, I am better than him. I am from fire and he's from clay. And it's not that's literally beside the point. What's better, clay or fire? The point is not the clay. That's not what made Adam Adam. It's the ruah, the spirit that was in him. It's the meaning in the form. It's not about the form. My form is better than your form. It's literally being veiled from meaning. And so the path of Iblis is basically being veiled from meaning by form. And the path of light, the path of the true Adamites, is to see the meaning through the form. And I totally agree that this can be done through more intellectual, rational discourse and reflection. But I think the arts, especially, are this incredibly profound, potent means for us to access the ecstatic exchange of the meanings and forms.
Just as a little corollary of that little branchings, ramifications. I was reading in a poem. There's a 13th, 14th century poem written by an Andalusia agricultor called Ibn Luyun, and it's 1,300 verses. in which he condenses all of the agricultural knowledge, which was incredibly sophisticated at the time. And it was already a condensation of Byzantine, Persian, Yemeni, all different kinds of, knowledge in a poem so that people could memorize it, repeat it. Homer's books, his, the Odyssey, the Iliad, they were actually orally transmitted because they were in rhyming verse, so it's easier to memorize. And it struck me that he describes turned earth as qalib, which is turned, right? Overturned from qalaba is turned, but it's also the root of qalb because the heart is turned. This is again one of the little ways in which we can make those connections. And Arabic is phenomenal for that. And I'm not by any means an Arabist, but I am obsessed with etymologies and those, the webs of meaning, like how one meaning can seemingly embrace things that seem very disparate, but it's that stretching. And talking of stretching and etymology, I really like what you said about the symbolic and the diabolic. I've always found it really interesting as well that attention and intention come from the same root of tendere, which is to stretch. And we have it in Spanish. Tender means to like hang out laundry. It means to like hang something out or stretch it out. But attendere is to stretch towards, and intendere is to stretch within. And it's this stretching, I think, that enables people to break out of this like very rigid, I'm in my in group, my little bubble, my group, and we're better than other people. It requires stretching. It's like going to the gym for your soul. Like you just have to be able to stretch and accept, oh, there's a connection between this and this. And it might not seem immediately apparent, but the connection is there. The connection is there. And it's like a muscle that you have to learn to employ. And once you start employing it, you see it everywhere. Like this morning, I was reading about a village near me called Lanharon. You've been there. The name actually comes from Al Harum, which is the spring of Harun, whoever Harun was. And there's a spa that has 7 of these springs, and they're really healing springs. They have magnesium, and they're ferruginous. They have bubbles. They're really like good for all different parts of your organism. And just by the by, in the website, it's describing like how it's the fault of the earth that produced these springs, right? And immediately I'm like, the fault, that's interesting. A fault. Because a fault line, it means something different in geology. Like if you take it from like a scientific sort of practical viewpoint, it's just a place where 2 tectonic plates meet, and there's a bit of a break between them, and they can move, they can be activity, obviously creates earthquakes. But it's also a fault line. It's the crack that, Leonard Cohen famously said, paraphrasing Rumi, the crack is where the light gets in. There is a crack in everything. That's where the light gets in. And in this case, the crack in the earth is where healing waters come out. That literally there's the Ain, the eye, the source is emerging, and it's healing. Like this is how the earth responds. Like there's a break, we're gonna fill it. We're gonna use that as an opportunity to produce something that is good for the earth, for people, for animals, for the earth. SubhanAllah, like these are kind of things that, like, if you were just to look at that from a purely geological standpoint, it's interesting. It's valuable knowledge. But you can also say, I'm going to try and see how that relates to me in my life. And what other meanings can I connect to that in my own lived experience?
No, that's beautiful. And in all times, and especially ours, we are in need of people and means to stretch beyond, to stretch across context. And in that regard, I know you wrote a book. Well, you have a number of books, but you wrote something of an autobiography or a memoir called Invisible Muslim. Um, and I wonder if you might just say a few words about your intention behind that book and really like what that book is about.
Yeah, so the subtitle of this book, which took us quite a while, me and my editor, to come up with, is Journeys Through Whiteness and Islam. And excuse me. So I started writing for a quarterly journal in the UK called Critical Muslim. And the editor at the time, she said to me, I really like the way that you write. You have a very unique viewpoint. You need to write about your experience as a second generation white Muslim. And literally that question rolled around my brain for about 5 years, and I cringed very badly every time I thought of it, because me writing a book about my whiteness, I mean, that felt weird, and I'm very uncomfortable. I thought, do I have any right to write about this? Is this going to be, you know, am I going to get cancelled? Like, I just had no idea. And then I did always think, when I was young, like being at high school and things like that, people would ask me like, "Oh, your name's Arabic. Are you Arab? Are you part Arab? Are you half Muslim?" You know, like they'd ask all these very kind of crazy questions. Um, and it would sort of make me laugh, but it would also obviously give me, it was quite unsettling to be like, well, am I? I have some friends, them also from the Bay Area, but they lived in Saudi Arabia for a long time. And I didn't hear this anecdote in time, otherwise it would have gone into this book. They're white, right? And the kids are white. And they were at a mosque in Saudi. And at one point, one of this family, the daughter turns around to the mom, she's just looking around at everyone around her, just like, "Mom, are you sure we're Muslim?" Like there's that kind of doubt that's implanted into you, that it's like, again, it's about the forms and it's about externals. Do you have a particular way of dressing or looking, or your culture, or this or that? And there's, there are a lot of assumptions among non-Muslims and among Muslims of like what, a normative Muslim looks like. And that assumption is going to be different everywhere you go, because again, it's about the in group. If you're in your world and you're in your, context, without traveling out of it or without being exposed to anything outside of it, it's completely natural to think this is the norm. This is the way that it's done. And I think we've come a long way since then. When I was growing up in the UK, there was one other Muslim family in the whole school, and they didn't coincide. The kids didn't coincide with me and my sister's years, so we didn't get to know them. A Pakistani family, and almost everyone else was white. Obviously, it's nobody's fault, whatever body they're born into. There's no, again, it's like, it's not a question of, is clay better than fire? It's like ridiculous. Apples better than oranges. But it's that question of belonging. Like, where do you really belong? And I think there is a really serious question for white people, which many of us are not really wanting to address. There are a lot of questions, but first of all, white people often don't really like talking about whiteness. It's become a bit of a taboo to talk about it. It's almost like, how could you even mention that? But it's like, okay, well, step out of your comfort zone and look at this scenario, and there's a lot to say, actually. But also looking at what whiteness even means. Like, what is there a such thing as a white culture? Is there such thing as white indigeneity anymore? Because there clearly used to be, but so much of that has been destroyed, and people have been so alienated, partly by alienation from the land, alienation from almost all traditions have been, either annihilated or destroyed. In England, particularly, I'm thinking of. If you go to Scandinavia, it's different. They have traditions, then they have a sense of who they are. If you go to Ireland, they have that. If you go to Scotland, they have that. But England, particularly, I mean, I think about where I live in Andalusia. We have flamenco. We have, in every town. Well, in my fairly small town, there's a festival of flamenco every year. You hear people playing it in their houses. You hear people singing in the streets. You hear people with radios. Somebody's playing a guitar in a shop. It's present, even though it is a Gitano cultural phenomenon, but it's very highly recognized. You can go to a conservatory and study for 4 years just the clapping. Just the clapping. It's respected. I mean, it has been obviously very touristified as well, but it's highly respected as this kind of repository of like a sense of who we are. And I think, do we have that for folk music in England? Folk music feels very marginal. It's very much like you go to a certain pub or a certain festival once a year, and it's like not many people listen to folk music. It's kind of meh. People don't really respect it very much. And so much of that has been really, really destroyed. And then what happens is, you'll see, I mean, again, I'm speaking specifically to the English context. right now there are riots happening. There's far right white supremacist riots, particularly being aimed at South Asians, people of color, Black people, and especially Muslims. And this is a connection that they have made that has nothing to do with the original. Well, there isn't one particular instigating moment, but it's just that there is this prejudice that's there under the surface, and Muslims are the scapegoat as the other, as something different to themselves. So anyway, long-winded way to say, for me growing up, there was always this question of, am I one or am I the other? I'm straddling these two worlds. I'm kind of somehow, am I sitting on a fence? Or am I fully embracing both of them? Am I fully embodying both of these things? Can they both coexist in me without me spontaneously combusting? Right? And in order to get to that place, I had to really ask myself a lot of questions about who I am. What is Islam? What is culture? And, I probably spent an awful lot of time in my head, far more than I should have done.
Hmm.
But I mean, ultimately, Islam is welcoming. It wants you to be there. Like Muslims, there are exceptions to this, obviously, but Islam, it wants people to be together. Suhbah is so important. People just being welcomed, your neighbors being fed, this awareness of the collective is so important to us that this, for me, transcends those questions and those, seeming contradictions. And also, of course, you travel, you go to West Africa, you go to Singapore, you'll see completely different worlds, but they're all Muslim. Not that I've been to either of those two places, but, to set an example. So eventually you come back to, like, what is the essence of this? What is the essence of Islam? What is the essence of it, of being a human? Is
Yeah.
it something as superficial as the color of my skin? Or is it really about the meaning? And that's not to ignore any of those cultural manifestations either, because they're beautiful. Like, this is part of where art resides as well. And so I think there's so much value to learning about those and celebrating them as well. But also, again, recognizing that the truth lies beyond.
Mm. Yeah, and I think, I mean, to your last point, I was reflecting on the fact I was reading a text recently, and it was speaking about how the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, obviously he was in a highly, highly tribalized society, which had all kind of prejudice and status based on your tribe and your affiliation, different than our contemporary world around race, but also a lot of similarities in that regard. And it mentioned that he basically, by calling to Islam was like a super tribe. This is the phrase, like basically called them beyond, or you could say a supra tribe, transcending tribe, or a meta tribe
Mm.
that was based on virtue and quality and identifying with specific things, right? That, the farewell servant, the Arab is not superior to the non-Arab, nor the non-Arab to the Arab, black to the white, nor white to the black, illa bitaqwa. So there is a kind of tribal affiliation, but that tribal affiliation is a quality which is unseen, which
Mm.
is taqwa. It's God consciousness. It's your degree to which you embody a type of presence or awareness of the divine reality. Um, anyway, so I think there's a lot there, and I'm curious because obviously your parents embraced a community, or in a community that was predominantly white Muslims, but it seems like did you have a sense that you were part of that broader community when you grew up, or did you feel like kind of separate from that when where you weren't necessarily embedded in that community?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because I think in terms of just the circumstances of where we were living, so we lived in a series of small villages in the English countryside where, you go into rural places and it's very white. Like, there's not many people of color around. And I think due to that kind of, very intense experience that my parents had on becoming Muslim and living in community, living in very, like very close contact with other people, basically living in communes for a period of time. My dad also lived in a squat for a while.
Mm.
Like multiple families all together and the kids all in one room and the parent, like that uh, sort of communal and collective sort of experiment. It was like a social experiment because that was very unusual for their context at that time. And it was kind of a reinvention of something that they had an idea that, like, pre-modern people did this, and it wasn't necessarily true either. So I think by dint of that, the intensity of that experience, like they forged very close friendships that then became like my broader family, like those connections that they formed, their children are very, I feel very close to, like
Mm.
just naturally, because like it's like people have gone through, I don't want to make it sound worse than it was, but people have gone through like shared trauma. You have these like trauma bonds. And like
Mm.
you kind of relate to people because you've had these shared experiences, um, which are also very beautiful too. Like you can, there's a very deep kind of knowing that you have of one another because you
Mm.
it had the very specific experience that not many people have had, and you know that you understand one another and you don't have to explain yourself to anybody. That is really very beautiful, and I really treasure those friendships and those relationships. So when I was growing up, there was definitely a lot more. I felt a certain sense of connectedness to other white Muslims or people who had been either converted or the children of converts. Um, but there was a real longing to feel that as well with the broader community of Muslims worldwide. It was more to do with the context that we lived in, like this small village. There was like, I'd be like, kind of run up to like an Arab in the street, be like, hey, Assalamu alaikum. It's kind of embarrassing. Also, it's a bit awkward, doesn't always work. Um, or it might, like, they might be like, hey, you might suddenly become best friends with people. Why not? Um, but there was always a certain reticence there as well, of that sort of self-doubt of, am I going to be accepted? Am I going to be looked at? And at that time, definitely growing up, there was, I think, a bit more of that uh sort of normative idea about how Islam has to be practiced.
Mm.
If you're not practicing this way, like, takfir was a big problem. Like people would be
Mm.
told you're not really Muslim because you're not dressing the right way, you're not praying the right way. You've made a mistake in your prayer, it's not valid. And you'd go into mosques and people would tell you that kind of thing. Like your ankles weren't covered, your prayer isn't valid. This kind of thing, which unfortunately has really, I think it has done so much damage to, people who were born into Muslim families and who were given this idea of Islam and then taught, well, I'm not good enough. My practice is not good enough. Therefore, I don't belong here. And so Islam is not for me. And that is, I think, a huge tragedy. It's a huge tragedy because all of the mercy, all of the rahmah that is at the center of Islam has been taken out. And if
Mm.
you've taken out the mercy, then what are you left with? You're left with rituals. And those rituals might still be of some benefit, but if there's no mercy, then it can actually become it can become painful to people. And so there's religious trauma. There's definitely spiritual trauma for people who've been raised in very harsh.
Mm.
I know people who've like gone away from Islam because their parents have taught them in that way, and then had to kind of come back to Islam by a completely different means. Like
Mm.
reading books from a different tradition within the Islamic
Mm.
kind of super tradition. Or maybe they meet somebody. Maybe they meet a convert. They might just have to look at it from a different window to be able to come back into the house, sort of thing. And I think the door always needs to be open. There's no way that we can even have a building if the door is always shut. That's, I think,
Mm.
for me, that's a core value based on my own experience, and that I'm sensitized to the fact that so many people don't feel that sense of belonging. They don't feel that welcome. I mean, I say so many. Obviously, there are many, many more who do feel welcome, but there are those situations where people feel excluded. And I think those are the ones that we really need to ask ourselves, well, what is a tribe that we're subscribing to here?
Yeah.
Are we just creating another little in group? Are we creating another subgroup where, and like Sunni versus Shia, or, you can give hundreds of examples where people will look for the difference instead of looking for the similarity. And I think that's really a huge error.
Yeah. I mean, I think, and yeah, just watching what's happening in the UK and having spent, obviously, never lived in the UK, but spent a lot of time there over the years, coming back on tour and being. I spent a lot of time in Muslim communities in the north of England and different towns and villages, I reflected on the fact that outside of London, which is obviously very multicultural, a lot of Muslims of all different backgrounds, all kind of converts and things like that. The the difficulty, frankly, in um, when the vast majority of Muslims in the north of England are of one specific, um, are South Asian, essentially, are Desi, and so for someone who's not, um, like a white Muslim convert or a black Muslim convert for that matter, it's really actually a bit challenging just to navigate because, again, Islam is ideals and realities. Like it's the idea, but it comes in the form of a cultural expression, right? Which isn't necessarily a bad thing because you humans are cultural beings. You can't do away with that. But by comparison's sake, I think even though I'm still pretty in awe of the fact that I'll meet people and like they're still like really fascinated by like white Muslim converts. Like they've never really interacted. And to me, I forget about it. I don't even think about it because it was so normal in my lived experience, not just obviously because of me personally, but just the environments that I was around. I mean, in the Bay Area, where I was kind of like molded in my Islam in my 20s, there were so many converts of all different backgrounds. And that was just a norm. And I still meet people who've never actually met a convert to Islam. Like that's still like a very foreign idea to them. And ironically, this is what I was kind of going to mention is that the American context is different than what
Mm,
I've experienced in Europe and the UK because there's actually a mass conversion of quote unquote indigenous Americans,
mm,
meaning Black Americans,
mm,
African Americans in the mid 20th century, such that that was actually the a lot of us that are white, um, and we could mention even many of the kind of prominent white American Muslims that embraced Islam in the 90s and early 2000, their engagement with Islam was actually through Black Muslims and that expression. And there was always a sense of like normalcy of conversion to Islam and almost like quote unquote indigeneity of conversion to Islam. Or you
mm,
see what I'm saying? Like because it was so common and it was actually through that then engaged with more like immigrant communities or children of immigrants, but it was like through my initial entrance into Islam with Black Muslim communities. And I think because of that, that's different than like what we see in the UK and Europe, in the sense that there was a sense of like normalcy in converting to Islam because of that experience actually. And um obviously still for like white Americans is very different because if a Black American converts to Islam, it's just like, okay, yeah, that's normal. But a white person is still kind of like,
mm.
what? Like in the more general sense. But yeah, I'm just curious if what your thoughts about that.
Yeah, so it is curious you bring this up because I mean I am an American national, have
Mhm,
always been since I was born, but haven't ever lived in the US. So my awareness of the Muslim context there is all through like meeting people who've traveled somewhere,
mhm,
to Europe or but my first one of my first interests really like academically was Africa because I had this sense that like I mean Africa is the only Muslim majority continent. And we often forget this. Like a lot of Muslims, like Arabs or South Asians, might kind of not register that fact. Somalis, for example, are the largest diaspora community from Africa, and you meet a lot of Somalis all over the place. And they've been Muslim for I don't know how many hundreds of years. So what I felt, what I was very drawn to, and I was attracted to, and I was also very into hip hop, and I was into, like Black literature, Black American literature. And then I was like, I was really interested in what is this? Because I kind of got the sense that these were the people who were grappling with race and identity and belonging, like
mhm,
more than anybody else, at least in the English language, and certainly
mhm,
in French too. But I mean, I wasn't like reading much of that per se. And then so I did African studies, well, African language and culture at SOAS, which is the School of Oriental African Studies in London, and spent a year in East Africa, I studied Swahili. I was very much kind of like, I want to get outside of the Eurocentric, um, vortex. I want to step out and almost kind of be absorbed somewhere else. I want to forget about this altogether. I want to forget that I'm white. I want to forget that I'm English. And I want to sort of be totally absorbed in this other context. And of course, I got to the point where like I was speaking Swahili very fluently. I did my whole last year of university, well, my third year of university, all in Swahili, all of my essays, all that kind of stuff. Even my accent, I could fool people. At times I could fool people because I have as a singer, I have a skill with phonetics. But at a certain point, you kind of realize this is ridiculous. Like I can't possibly be somebody else. I can't be somebody that I'm not. But I can learn from and through my admiration of people who are totally comfortable in who they are, whether they've had to work towards that after centuries of abuse and persecution, or because that's just they're from Africa. They've been Muslim for hundreds of years, or 1,000 years. This is a totally essential part of who they are, and it's natural to them. The way that like it may be for us, you learn to ride a bike. After that, you never lose that memory. That is muscle memory. It's embodied knowledge. It's part of who you are. You don't lose it unless you have like a lobotomy or something. Not they do that anymore, but like a brain injury. That's very extreme, but it's true. Those memories, everything that enters your brain, it stays in your brain forever unless it's actually destroyed. So I think my admiration there was like, I really admire people who could be totally comfortable in who they were as Muslims. And that was something that I lacked growing up. I was very much like on a back foot about myself, and I had a lot of self-doubt, even though I knew that being Muslim was a part of me. Like I was never going to like reject it or throw it out, but integrating it fully into my being, my understanding of myself, my context, it was a struggle, partly because there was just not many people. You look to your elders, you look to people who have done it before, who've gone through all of that, like aches and pains, the kind of growing pains. But interestingly, being in Spain, I noticed the same thing. I find that even people who have, reverted, let's say, some of those people will, through their surnames or through some other path, realize that their families actually were Muslim and had held on to some fragment of Islam for 500 years under oppression, under, literally a ban, prohibition of Islam. To the point where, for example, I met a guy who I thought he was Moroccan, even. He was married to a Moroccan woman. He was from Extremadura, which is a very mountainous area up next to bordering Portugal. It's similar to the mountains around Granada. And these were famous for being renegade places. Like, hundreds of years after the Inquisition began, they were still openly practicing Islam. They were saying, you're never going to convert us. They would do unbaptisms by going to springs and rivers. And like, even if they were forced to be baptized, they would be like, that's not happening. Yeah, sweetie, I'm in a podcast. Sorry. Where was I? Yeah, and you'd meet people also, for example, their surnames would be Hispanicized, but they were actually Arabic names, or there were names of plants or mountains or rivers or wells, del Pozo, del Monte, things like this. Romero, these were names that the Moriscos gave themselves because they were not allowed to use Arabic surnames anymore. So through that, they were able to say, actually, I'm just returning to who I really am. So, you can imagine that's an incredible phenomenon. And of course, for Black Americans, for somebody to come across Islam and be like, wow, this actually connects to something that is from potentially my own heritage. Of course, that's like an incredibly profound feeling of like coming home. And like I really am who I am now. And again, there is this sense I feel with Spain, south of Spain particularly, but also Catalonia, other places where Muslims lived for hundreds and hundreds of years even after Islam was banned. They never left. Actually, about 50% of the Moors of Spain never left, or they came back. They just had to assimilate in some way. I lost my train of thought now. I was talking about Andalus, and I just have so many things I want to say.
Well, I think, to pick up on some of the threads that you were touching on, yeah, I think it is a common phenomena for maybe Western people, modern Western people, but maybe particularly of European ancestry or white, is almost like a desire to, I think there's a understanding that like this category is illusory. It's not a it's not a place. It's not a culture. And that actually inclusion in this category, while it may have benefits for me and my ancestry, has like the opposite for other people that I'm around or that I love or care about. And so it's like a really like contentious category to like even grapple with. And I remember grappling with it at quite a young age, in my teenage years. And what does this mean?
Mm,
And yeah, I also went through a like very disinterested in anything European. And I think that's like also part of my inquiry into like other traditions, other religions, other philosophies around the world, and a kind of rebellion around like a European, Eurocentric version of history and philosophy and thought. And I definitely, as I embraced Islam, I was in, and I left and went to North Africa and went to Turkey and went to Yemen and just like early on. And I was definitely in a like burn my passport and like, I'm separating myself from that. Um, but what was interesting is, and I've mentioned that like you think when you travel, you're going to learn about other people's.
mm,
But what surprises you is how much you learn about yourself and your people's. Like it's the idea of like the fish doesn't know there's such thing as water, but taken out of water, you're like, wait, what is water? What is the thing that that I was swimming in before?
mm,
And ironically, I actually felt like, without even necessarily saying it overtly, that a lot of these kind of like beautiful teachers and sages and scholars and Sufis that I met, they kind of were, in a certain sense, especially because I was searching out those places that were unaffected by the corruptions of the modern world and these kind of conceptions that we had. But I was surprised at how those that were still in a very like pre-modern mindset, they were just kind of like, get over yourself
mm,
and um, take the truth and the beauty and the goodness and the reality and then go convey it and live it amongst your people. They were kind of like, get over the
yeah,
trip you're on about
yeah.
who you are and who I am and my identity and this. And that was really actually beautiful. It was like, oh yeah, yeah, like get over that, like don't be so caught up. And it's so interesting now because we see a younger generation now that we're kind of like the uncles and aunties feeling in the community, like where a lot of the young people in their 20s are really grappling with concepts of identity and all those things that we had to also go through. So I can like relate to what they're navigating. But, I think if we're really about this deen, then it really should be able to like offer some healing and some remedy to the kind of like existential angst and confusion
Mm,
that contemporary man and woman, Western man and woman, are kind of like thrown into.
mm. Yeah, I mean, I think the identity crisis is definitely like a phase that people go through. It's a
Mm,
very Western phenomenon, as far
mm,
as I can understand, as far as I can see. And I think that's part of what I mean for us and for many people, and before us as well. What attracts them to leave Europe is to like find people who are not going through this horrific existential crisis at the age of 17 because they don't know who the hell they are. And I think it comes down to also like what meaning do we ascribe to things, like what
mm,
meaning do we ascribe to whiteness? Like what does it even mean? At the end of the day, it kind of you look at it closely enough and you sort of go, there's nothing there. There's actually nothing there. And that's a problem. That's why it leads to this kind of void, which can either be like a kind of an implosion and people just feel really empty inside. And so they like, just go down a very self-destructive path potentially, or numb out and be like, oh, I'm just going to fill this void with, whatever capitalism presents to me as, normality. Um, because I think really it is very closely linked to capitalism, really. It not to take a very sort of political viewpoint of it, but I think it's undeniable that it's really like we're going to take away the things that really mean something to you, and we're going to replace them with things that we want you to value because it benefits us, not because it benefits you. And that's ultimately why this idea of like white indigeneity is kind of it's disappeared. It's like it's vanished
Mm,
because that connection, the things that actually made sense to us, I mean us meaning like people of England or Europe whose ancestors go back some way, those things have been degraded very, very, very much. And what has been left in its place is something that is it's not intrinsically valuable. It's only got any value for a very short period of time. And in a way, it's just another version of the same thing that's been happening
mm,
since day one for human beings. I mean, you read about it again and again in the Quran, like the people who, gather things, until they reach the graves. It's like you can be doing that. You could have been doing that in 7th century Arabia, where people were doing exactly the same thing. So we're not, when we talk about whiteness, I think we need to separate it from necessarily like a skin color, because it's a way of thinking that you could be from India, you could be from Nigeria, you could be from anywhere and have that mentality. You could have been from the Quraysh, and actually what we're not talking about a skin color, we're talking about a very ultimately fruitless, empty kind of fixation on dunya. And like, again, to quote Ibn Arabi, the dunya is like salt water. The more you drink of it, the thirstier you become. And this is, I think, the conundrum that we've been placed in is like, if you're fed a very materialistic, consumerist world from childhood, from babyhood, mums are, I understand mums are overworked and overwhelmed, but they're putting YouTube, like high speed animations on for their babies to make them eat, and I've seen this in Iran. You see this everywhere. It's not like it's just exclusive to America or England or something like that. Um, you're presented with things that ultimately are kind of empty, right? It's like being fed breakfast cereal all your life. Like there's no proper food. There's just carbs or like sort of empty, filler, but
mhm.
without really like anything substantial behind it. And eventually you start feeling like I'm unhealthy. I'm just unhealthy. That's all it is.
Well, I think you're speaking to the broader, like, basically the individuals in the West as a broad category are going through this identity crisis because the entire civilization is in an identity crisis. I mean,
Mm,
that's really what's happening. And um, race is like a byproduct of that. I mean, our friend Anudamini mentioned, that like in the pre-modern world, a pre-modern European world, which has its analog in other traditions, but the hierarchy was based on like the great chain of being. So at the top you had God, then you had the beings of light, the angels, then you had the prophets and saints and sages, and then you had the believers, and then you had the heathens, and then you had the animals, and then you had the plants and the minerals. But all of them are participating in a certain sense in gradations of the light of being. And the human being, everything is fixed in its place, but the human being has the ability to like draw near and even transcend the angels in certain conceptions of this. And he mentions then that when God, in the kind of like enlightenment in the modern world, the birth of the modern world, when God was taken out of the hierarchy, what happens is you can't have nothing at the top of the hierarchy. So it became, okay, we put our, if there's no God and no angels, then we're at the top of the hierarchy. And we, meaning like contemporary Western man,
mm,
and that then there became like this hierarchy of nearness to us, then this kind of like
yeah.
weird racial classification and
Mm,
stratification. There was like this whole pseudoscience around that.
mm,
And I think that, I mean, it's my personal belief that only a recovery of the sacred, because it is the foundational and fundamental um, truth and the orientation of the human being, is going to like resolve these issues around this, but also the ecological crisis, which is so, let's talk about real existential threat. all of these things are in a certain sense like the unintended consequences of the removal of the divine reality. And I mean, it's interesting what you say now, because you see all the like the riots in the UK and all these, and just more like nativist kind of like anti-immigrant movements spreading across Europe and America. But in the European context especially, there is a sense of like, we've lost who we were, we've lost our culture, our basis. But even the culture is a bit amorphous, right? And like, Abdul Hakim Murad in his essays, he makes an argument which probably won't be convincing to a lot of far right people, but his whole thing is that the basis of European culture traditionally was actually the sacred and enchantment, and for over 1,000 years, monotheism, focus on the divine and love of the saints and love of the prophets and things like that. And he was basically arguing that Islam is closer to the indigenous European way than, even though it looks culturally and it's in a different form, but the meaning is closer to the traditional European way of life and being. And his argument then is that you know Islam belongs here more than any of these like weird modern ideas and concepts and philosophies. But I do recognize that a lot of these like white Europeans are rebelling against a loss of something that they feel that is true. Now, how it's being acted upon, that's another story. But there is a sense of loss of something that's very real.
Yeah. And then it's like once you have that sense of loss, unless you can understand how that happened
Mm,
and who were the engineers of that, the architects
mhm,
of that, you end up scapegoating the person who
mhm.
is the easiest hit, like they're the closest target, or
Yes.
the most just the target that's presented to you as being like, okay, you don't fit the pattern that I believe is well, I believe it's the right pattern because it's my pattern. So then I'm gonna throw that all on you. Yeah, I mean, it is quite a radical statement by Abdul Hakim Murad. I hadn't heard him say that, but yeah, I mean, in a way, I do think it is something that I see people when they, convert, revert. Often there is this sense that like, oh, I'm coming back to my fitra. And so, like I mentioned before, like, you see in various places, like, for example, in Spain, you'll see people say, oh, I'm coming back to my original identity. Yes, but that's not the only way. The actual real identity is even beyond, the historical context of
Mm,
where you were born or where your ancestors were born, because ultimately we all come back to the arwah when we were with Allah. So that's our genuine home, and that's the reason why I think Sufism does, Islam in general, but this is something that is emphasized in Islam, in by Sufis, is we do have this transcendent self, this identity, which is the ruh. It is what was breathed into us. It's the nafas al-Rahman, the breath of the compassionate. It's the ensoulment, is the way that this clay was ensouled. And so the clay differs, but this ensouling is something that we all have in common. It is hard for people to accept that, I think. And because in a way, it's almost like you have to accept that you deserve that. You have to accept there is something of value, of very deep value in who I am. And it's nothing to do with my education or my parentage or the town I was brought up in or any of those things. Because those are easy things. Again, those are the easy targets. Those are the easy labels. I'm going to claim that. I'm going to lay claim to this, my name, my this, my that. Those are all the extrinsic values. But the intrinsic value, the true intrinsic value is that we have a soul that was a ruh that was breathed into us from Allah. Like, if that's your starting point, then you have to. And I think sometimes we do struggle to accept that and accept the
mm,
worthiness. There's a worthiness issue there. Like, I'm not sure I can really rest in this feeling. I'm not sure I can really accept um, this knowledge that I have this intimate relationship with the Creator, and that
mm,
Allah wanted me to be here, and Allah made me to be here. There's some kind of, I think it is a waswas actually, that comes in and says, no, you're not really deserving. You know,
mm.
you can't claim this. And actually, in a way, it's the only thing we can claim.
Yeah. No, that's beautiful, and I agree that that's the way out. I think like Ibn Arabi radiallahu anh mentions that each human being almost like accepted your contract before your spirit in the spiritual realm. You were presented with the contract, like you would be born into this family in this life in this context, and this will be your set of tests for your soul as it grows. Do you accept? And each one of us was like, yes. Right, so we all assented to this particular set of circumstances for our soul's journey in this lifetime. But your point, and if you look at the Quran, is that, what did the Quraysh say to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi? They're like, you're introducing something new. We don't recognize this. We didn't find our fathers upon this. And
Mm,
the Quranic response is actually your fathers and forefathers went away from what your original forefathers were
yeah.
on, which is the way of Abraham and the way of Ismail and this kind of this, primordial monotheistic way, Din al Hanif. But that's in that kind of context of Arabia, but the deeper Quranic narrative is that, in fact, as you said, all of us are spirits from the divine presence who entered into this realm, and in every nation and tribe, there was someone sent to call them to the one reality. And if the ultimate reality is one, then by extension, we're all spirits sent into this realm. Then those things which we differ upon are ultimately insignificant. They're just the specific trials and tribulations through the matrix of our, unique configuration that we have to navigate as a school, right? As a university of life that our souls have to navigate, you know, to try as a test. We have created you nations and tribes li ta'arafu. So we come to know each other, and through the other ourself, through this web of of lived realities that has its reality, but ultimately the spirit, and that is what is real. And yeah, I mean, I think that has interesting analogs. I mean, that's real in all times and places, but especially in our time and place when there's a real identity crisis which people are navigating. And unfortunately, often Islam is not taught in the local mosque like that. It's taught as almost like, you know, this is what our parents were on, this is our ethnic identity, and not necessarily this universal way. But I do see like a change in that discourse.
Yeah, yeah, it's definitely evolved. I think this is what I was meaning to say earlier when I lost my train of thought, is that when I was growing up, it was definitely a lot more I don't want to say Islam was more nascent in the UK, because Islam has been around for hundreds of years, since the 1700s, Liverpool,
Mhm.
Abdullah Qulim and people like this. But in larger communities, it was kind of younger, I guess you could say. And now we're in like fifth generation, and people have
Mhm.
a much more it's been tempered. That idea of like you're either like us or you're not like us has definitely been tempered. And
Mhm.
now I can say, like, even though growing up I didn't feel like I really belonged in many Muslim environments, now I don't go into absolutely every mosque. Like, I'm not out there, mosque hopping, but I can feel fairly confident that I'll go in there and I will be greeted, and I'll be, there'll be people maybe a bit curious and, ask me some questions, but it won't be hostile. It won't give me that sense of like, oh, I don't belong here. Like, I can, and that's also, I think, part of that maturation, or that just time, that the time goes by and you just get you get fed up of it. You get sick of the conversation in your head about who I am and where I belong. You start going, right, I just need to get on with it now, and just kind of put into practice what I believe and what I see to be true, and just take one day at a time. There's this very beautiful saying. I think it comes from an Antonio Machado poem. Um, El camino se hace andando. The path is made by walking. And I
Mhm.
think that comes back to our earlier point about the embodied knowledge, or the practice side of things. It's like bringing knowledge, bringing wisdom. I mean, wisdom really is information, data that has been plasmado, it's been kind of melted into the human experience,
Mm.
because it needs to be there. It needs to be lived, and it needs to be practiced upon. And through that, that's how you learn. And after a period of time, you kind of just go, oh, I've got used to this now, and this is my reality, and this is my normality. And it's no longer something novel or something strange. It's just I'm just riding my bike.
Yeah. Yeah, and then I think you find your tribe, your your super tribe, right? Of
Right.
people who have come to that same conclusion, and it doesn't really matter what their background is and or the accidents of their birth, but it's people that realize and are striving to relate to each other on that level of like you're a spirit having a human experience, I'm a spirit having a human experience, and we try to get on with the business of being human and navigating that with like love and grace and forgiveness and vastness towards each other. And I do see a beautiful way that, I mean, you know, we've been doing the last couple of years these retreats together in Spain. um and I just see like there's that call is really resonating with a wide range of people, especially young people that are seeking to, like you say, embody these truths and striving to follow that way. Um, in that regard, you've been very generous with your time, and I wanted to just close by allowing you. Of course, we talked about a couple things. We talked about Abdul Moore's collection of poetry and the book that that you compiled of some of his best works. And then we spoke about your memoir, Invisible Muslim. But maybe if you want to speak about um, anything else you're up to or you're working on. Obviously, we didn't mention, but one of my favorite things that you offer to the world is actually your music. I really enjoy that, as you know. But maybe if you want to just share with our listeners anything you have released recently or anything that you're up to so people can stay connected to you.
Well, I wish I could say I have some recent releases. I think of the sort of concentric circles of my work, and there's the Muslim Writers Salon, which I'm obviously very engaged in. I'm co-founder of, together with my co-founder Nafisa Cabreras Teves, and this is an online platform where it's a membership community. We try and foment and bring together Muslim writers of all different stripes, all different genres, and we do online events. Just yesterday, we had a really beautiful healing poetry session led by one of our members, who's an amazing poet, Rumi and Ibn Arabi. And it was very much about tapping into inspiration from nature as a source of healing. Um, and then I'm kind of doing a bit more journalism at the moment, which is unusual for me. But especially with the context of Palestine, Gaza, it's something that's been very, very present on my mind. It's been there since I was a teenager, since I first became aware of this, but more recently, it's something that I feel is very, very critical to be, devoting as much time as I can to that cause. But, poetry is always something that it's like a way back for me. It's a way back to the heart. It's a way back to that intuitive knowledge, that you could say heart knowledge. It's like there's a lot going on in my brain, and so sometimes I have to like. Lately, I've started doing some qigong to try and like just bring that energy right back down. But poetry for me is a way to come back to the heart, and so that I'm not in that sort of mental swirl of questions and so on. There's a great quote by Suhrawardi actually, that you cannot, what is it? The one who tries to approach the truth with arguments is like one who tries to approach the sun with a lamp.
Oh, sure.
The arguments they're useful for something, like lamps are useful for something, but like the truth is something so much bigger. So that's one way that I've been I try and stay, a bit more centered. And music is sort of like the circle within that. It's like the core of it. And it's the thing that I do the least, unfortunately. Inshallah, just, waiting for those opportunities to open up. Because, songwriting is it's very, very close to my heart. But also again, devotional music has been something that has really helped me to kind of step outside of that Eurocentric kind of paradigm, because folk music, devotional music in Arabic, in Persian, and I started singing along with Qawwali and whatever those traditions that you can sing those words and those melodies, and they become a part of you. You're physically engaged with it, and it isn't just an intellectual pursuit. It's something that you are actually doing it in a group with people. You sing together, your hearts actually synchronize because you're taking breaths at the same time. There's all kinds of like health benefits, mental health benefits to singing. um, so subhanallah, that is something that of course I'm always sort of just waiting for the moment to do more of that. But in the meantime, I find poetry is the kind of the way back. And actually, I'd love to read something. This is something I
Yes,
just
ma'am.
wrote yesterday, so it's very very fresh, and it's sort of inspired by. It's similar to the appeal epiphany that I read earlier by Daniel Abu Hamid, in the sense of, you know, the prompt was take an everyday activity and like push it to its kind of wildest imaginative form. Like where would it take you? It can be surreal and whatever. And so this is very raw, but I'll read it. I don't know how much I'll edit it in the end, but I like things that are raw as well and unedited. I pour a glass of water, and out comes a river. Out comes the spout of a whale, a waterfall. It drenches the kitchen table. Algae gets caught in the cutlery jar. I open the front door and it torrents out into the street, washes the dog shit off the tarmac, knocks teenage boys off their feet, soaks their Nike Air Jordans. Pretty soon the whole town is underwater, and I was just trying to quench my thirst. Houses float to the surface. The tops of our heads brush the clouds. Tents bob and churn. The blood that soaks the earth dyes the water pink. Seeds tumble in the current my overgenerous glass created. Around us and not on us, said the prophet when his prayer for rain was too well answered. The people cry out for cleansing. Now the flood has come. The world is an endless pane of glass. Still, everybody is clean, not a stain on any shirt. The clamor dies down, not a voice is raised. We float on anything buoyant, doors, tables, inner tubes, visions of tomorrow. A duck paddles past. Once the whole planet is submerged, every living being floating or swimming, the waters begin to recede. A great inhalation of the soil beneath sucks it into subterraneous lakes, secretes it for later use. Trees break through the surface, glinting. The torments have been forgotten, the tormentors washed away. Our feet descend slowly, touch the damp ground. A frog stares, creature beloved of the Rasul. Houses relax, furniture outside on the lawn. The disaster we feared is over. The howling has subsided. We begin.
MashaAllah. Beautiful. Beautiful.
I kind of felt Daniel Abdulhai there, just kind of like,
Mhm.
just take it, just go with it, see where it
Yeah.
goes.
The line or the phrase anything buoyant. That's really
Yeah.
beautiful. It's just those two words together.
Oh, that's the title. There you go.
That
Thank
could
you.
be a title, yeah. Anything buoyant. Yeah, I like that.
SubhanAllah. I think we just have to fight back in whatever we have to resist in whatever way we can with our words, with our hearts, with our souls against whatever, just rail against and whatever injustice we're seeing, the emptiness, the misery, the fear, the divisiveness. We have to use this ruh that we've been given, this breath. Otherwise, we'll drown.
Yeah. Yeah, and exactly what you say, because I think a lot of times people feel incapacitated, and we all feel that at times, like, what can I do? But what you can do is create beauty and love and be of service and care for people. And like, in a certain sense, what you're saying, the greatest resistance, raging against the dying of the light. Like, you are
Mm.
literally to whatever capacity that we're all able to serve the light and to live the light and to be the light and to receive the light and to spread the light. And that is all that we can do. And we all have different ways. There's infinite ways to do that. There are you know as many ways to God as there are breaths of creatures. And I believe that like the arts and the creativity and the way that you're doing, we're striving to do, like cultivating community around beauty and goodness and truth and expression is really the medicine, you know.
Alhamdulillah. Thank
I
you so
mean,
much for this beautiful conversation. It's been really, really enlightening.
thank you. Allah bless you.
I mean, ومنا ومنكم.
Assalamu alaikum, and thank you for listening to Path and Present. Path and Present is a podcast that is community supported. If you like these conversations and want to see them spread far and wide and want to become a patron of this podcast, you can visit our Patreon at patreon.com/pathandpresent. And there are various tiers where you can support this podcast. $5 a month makes you a supporter of the Path and gives you a personalized thank you note from myself. $20 a month makes you a seeker of wisdom and gives you access to a bunch of bonus material, including unreleased episodes and sessions from previous Rumi Center courses and retreats. $50 a month, you join Baraka's book club, where I share reflections on my favorite books. There's always a book of the month, and we get to reflect upon it. And of course, many of the authors featured in this podcast are some of the authors of my favorite books. So we get to dive deep on that and read together. For $100 a month, you join the Sustainer Circle and you get a personalized shout out in an episode. And also we have a monthly Zoom Q&A and discussion for those in the Sustainer Circle. It's an intimate group of like-minded seekers. And you also get access to everything in the previous tiers. So I want to, again, thank you for listening. Of course, like and subscribe and share with friends and family who you think might be interested. And if you want to see these conversations continue, please visit us at patreon.com/pathandpresent. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.